I never thought a family dinner could change the way I saw everything I believed about trust, safety, and love. It was supposed to be just another evening at my parents' house. Warm lights, the smell of roasted chicken in the air, laughter bouncing around the dining room walls. But what happened at that table would haunt me for years. It started with something so ordinary, so painfully normal, that even now I can't wrap my head around how quickly the night spiraled into horror. My uncle, the kind of man who always commanded the room without ever raising his voice, sat across from me. He had always been unpredictable, but I never imagined he could be cruel. I remember holding my fork, mid-bite, when he leaned over to whisper something I still can't repeat without shaking. His words weren't the only thing that broke me that night. A single, sudden movement, and I heard the snap before I even felt the pain. My wrist bent in a way no human wrist should, the shock spreading through my entire body. But here's the part that still makes my stomach turn. As I sat there, frozen in disbelief, tears stinging my eyes, my uncle didn't stop. He didn't apologize. He didn't even look at me. He simply went back to eating his dinner, chewing calmly as though nothing had happened. In that moment, surrounded by clinking silverware and muffled conversation, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't just about a broken bone. It was about silence, about power, about how families can bury the ugliest truths under polite smiles and steaming plates of food. And that night, I had to decide, would I stay silent too, or would I finally break more than just my wrist? When I tell people what happened that night, most of them think I'm exaggerating. How could he break your wrist and just keep eating? They ask, eyes wide with disbelief. But that's the truth, and the silence that followed was almost worse than the pain itself. Because the real story isn't just about one violent act, it's about what happens when the people you love the most choose to look away instead of standing up for you. For years, I thought family dinners were sacred moments, places where you could feel safe, loved, and seen. But that night shattered the illusion. I realized that sometimes the most dangerous battles aren't fought with strangers, but with the very people who should protect you. What do you do when loyalty collides with survival? When love feels like a cage instead of a home? Those are the questions I wrestled with as I tried to piece my life back together after that dinner. And that's what I'm going to share with you today, the whole story. From the seconds leading up to the snap of my wrist, to the unbearable silence around the table, to the aftermath that forced me to make choices I never thought I'd face. This isn't just my story. It's a story about power, silence, and breaking free from the grip of fear. And as painful as it is to relive it, I know someone out there needs to hear it, because maybe you felt silence too. Maybe you've been hurt by someone who should have loved you. And maybe you've wondered if telling your truth would cost you everything. So stay with me until the end. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, subscribe to this channel now, because silence only wins if we let it. Dinner at my parents' house was always a complicated ritual. On the surface, it looked warm and welcoming. Candles flickering in the center of the table, the scent of roasted chicken and garlic mashed potatoes filling the room, plates clinking as they were set down in front of us. But underneath, there was always this undercurrent of tension, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something unspoken to erupt. I was 25, old enough to recognize that not everything about family was as picturesque as it seemed, yet I still showed up, because I wanted to believe in the illusion of unity. That night, I told myself, would be no different. Until it was. My uncle arrived late, as usual, stepping through the door with his booming presence that made everyone straighten up just a little. He wasn't a man who needed to raise his voice to dominate a room. He had this way of making you feel small, even when he smiled. My mother offered him a plate, my father poured him a drink, and I tried to shrink into the background, hoping he wouldn't notice me too much. But his eyes found me almost immediately, scanning me with a sharpness that made my stomach twist. I forced a polite smile, pretending everything was fine, because that was the unspoken rule of our family. Don't stir the pot. The conversation started off harmless enough. My cousins laughed about old stories. My mother asked about work. My father retold a joke I'd heard a dozen times before. On the outside, it was almost comforting, but inside I felt myself bracing, waiting. My uncle leaned back in his chair, speaking in short, cutting sentences that made others chuckle nervously. He had a gift for making cruelty sound like humor, for disguising venom as wit. And every time his words landed, there was this ripple of discomfort that no one dared to name. When he spoke directly to me, it was with that same blend of mockery and challenge. "Still single?" he asked, loud enough for the entire table to hear. The laughter that followed was forced, awkward, but no one intervened. I swallowed the lump in my throat and muttered something about focusing on my career. My wrist tightened around my fork, and I tried to laugh it off, but I could feel his eyes linger on me, calculating like a cat watching a mouse squirm. And in that silence, the weight of being his target pressed down heavier than any words he could have spoken. I excused myself to pour another glass of water, needing a moment to breathe. In the kitchen, I stared at the sink, trying to gather myself. My pulse was racing, my palms damp, and I told myself I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. This was how it always went. Little digs, little humiliations, reminders that I was never safe from his reach. And every time, the family chose silence over confrontation. When I walked back into the dining room, I wore a smile that felt plastered on, but I knew he could see the cracks. He always saw the cracks. The meal carried on, each course like a performance we were all unwilling participants in. I tried to focus on my food, to let the flavors distract me, but I couldn't. My uncle was right across from me, and every bite he took seemed like a reminder that he was in control. His knife cut through the chicken with deliberate precision, and his gaze flicked up just enough to make my skin crawl. I wanted to disappear, to fade into the wallpaper, but instead, I sat there, trapped in plain sight. Every second felt like it was leading towards something inevitable, though I couldn't yet name what it was. At one point, my cousin tried to shift the mood, telling a story about a road trip gone wrong. Everyone laughed, grateful for the temporary relief. I joined in, pretending to relax, even though my shoulders were still tight with tension. I glanced around the table, wondering if anyone else felt the way I did. That uneasy awareness that something was building, that this dinner was not as harmless as it seemed. But when I looked into their faces, all I saw were practiced smiles and carefully averted eyes. It was like we were all actors in a play, following a script none of us dared to rewrite. Then came the moment that still replays in my mind like a scene burned into film. I was cutting into my food when my uncle leaned slightly forward, his voice low but sharp. He whispered something only I could hear, words that made my chest tighten and my hands tremble. I froze, fork halfway to my mouth, unable to process how something so vile could be said so casually in the middle of a family meal. My eyes darted to my mother, then my father, but they were both focused on their plates. It was as if the entire room conspired to pretend nothing was happening, even though I could feel my world tilting. The tension between us was invisible to everyone else, but to me, it was suffocating. My wrist ached from gripping the fork too tightly, my knuckles white with strain. I wanted to throw my chair back, to shout, to demand that someone acknowledge what was happening, but the words caught in my throat. Silence pressed against my chest like a weight, and in that silence, my uncle's smile widened as though he knew he had won. It was a smile that promised more than just discomfort. It promised dominance, control, and the certainty that no one would stop him. I tried to focus on my breathing, to remind myself that I could make it through dinner if I just stayed quiet. But then, in a blur that felt both sudden and inevitable, it happened. His hand shot across the table, grabbing my wrist with a force that made me gasp. The sound was instant, a sharp crack that seemed to echo louder than the clinking silverware around us. Pain radiated through my arm like fire, stealing my breath, blurring my vision. I stared at him in shock, waiting for someone, anyone, to react. But the only sound that followed was the steady scrape of his fork against his plate. And as I sat there, clutching my arm, the most horrifying part wasn't just the pain. It was the silence. The way the others lowered their eyes, the way my uncle calmly chewed his food as though nothing had happened. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last, as I realized that I was utterly alone at that table. And in that moment, with tears burning in my eyes, I began to understand that what broke that night wasn't just my wrist. It was the fragile illusion that family would ever choose truth over silence. The pain hit me like a lightning strike, hot and searing, crawling up my arm until it stole the air from my lungs. I wanted to scream, to stand, to demand that the world acknowledge what had just happened, but I couldn't. The room felt frozen, though in reality it wasn't. Forks scraped against plates, glasses clinked softly, and someone let out a nervous laugh, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. My uncle sat across from me, chewing slowly, deliberately, his eyes avoiding mine. The disconnect between my agony and their composure made me question my own reality. Was I imagining this? No. The throbbing in my wrist proved otherwise. I cradled my arm against my chest, trying to hide the trembling that rattled through my body. My mother glanced up at me once, her eyes flickering with something I couldn't read. Fear, maybe shame, but she looked down almost instantly. My father poured himself another glass of wine, his movements mechanical, practiced, as though repetition could erase what he had just witnessed. My cousins avoided my gaze entirely, their chatter forced, brittle, like glass that might shatter with the wrong touch. Every second stretched, and in that stretch, my silence became part of the performance. Inside, I was screaming. The pain was unbearable, but worse than the physical agony was the dawning realization that no one at that table would come to my defense. I had always known my uncle was cruel, but I believed, deep down, that someone, anyone, would draw the line if he went too far. Yet here I was, my wrist swelling, my breath uneven, while the people I loved most chose to pretend nothing had happened. Betrayal is a slow burn, but in that moment, it consumed me all at once, leaving me raw and hollow. I wanted to stand up, to leave, but my body betrayed me. The dizziness made it hard to move, and the fear of drawing more attention kept me rooted to my chair. I thought about calling for help, about naming what he had done out loud, but my throat closed up every time the words formed. What if they all turned on me? What if speaking made me the problem, not him? My uncle's calm chewing, the scrape of his knife, seemed to say it all. You can't win here. This is my table, my rules, and no one will save you. Tears slipped down my face, hot and humiliating. I tried to wipe them away discreetly, but the more I tried to hide them, the more visible they became. Still, no one acknowledged me. My mother's hands busied themselves with serving more potatoes. My father laughed at something my uncle said, and my cousins reached for seconds, as though the dinner hadn't been interrupted by violence. I had never felt so invisible, so erased as I did in that moment. The silence was louder than any scream, and it made me realize just how small my place in this family truly was. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. My wrist throbbed in sync with my heartbeat, each pulse a reminder of the violation I had just endured. I tried to breathe evenly, to steady myself, but every inhale came shallow, shaky. I thought about all the times I had brushed off his comments, laughed when he mocked me, stayed quiet when he overstepped. I had trained myself to endure, but this was different. This wasn't just words. This was proof, tangible, undeniable, that endurance came at a cost, and the cost was my body breaking under his grip. When dessert was served, the absurdity of it nearly made me choke. Plates of pie were passed around, whipped cream dolloped on top, while my wrist swelled to twice its size. My uncle accepted his slice with a grin, his hands steady, his demeanor calm. I wanted to slam my good hand against the table and scream, "Look at me! Look at what he's done!" But my voice stayed locked inside, buried beneath years of conditioning that taught me not to disrupt the peace, not to bring shame, not to make waves. And so I sat, swallowing tears along with each shaky breath, while the sweetness of pie filled the air like poison. As the meal wound down, I hoped desperately for a moment of rescue. Maybe my mother pulling me aside, maybe my father offering to take me to the hospital, maybe one of my cousins whispering that they'd seen everything. But nothing came. The plates were cleared, the table wiped down, the leftovers stored in neat containers, as if the evening had unfolded without incident. My uncle stretched his arms and thanked my mother for the meal, his voice steady, his body language casual. And everyone smiled back at him. Everyone except me. The night ended with hugs, goodbyes, and the kind of practiced warmth that makes strangers believe a family is whole. I stood stiffly when my uncle approached, my broken wrist hidden against my chest, and I flinched when his hand brushed my shoulder in a mockery of affection. "Take care," he said, his tone almost gentle, though I heard the menace beneath it. I didn't respond. My lips refused to move, my body refused to betray how shattered I felt. And as I stepped outside into the cool night air, the weight of everything pressed down on me harder than the throbbing in my wrist. Walking away from that house, I understood something I had never wanted to face. Silence doesn't just protect the abuser, it imprisons the victim. My family's choice to look away had chained me to my pain, binding me to a truth no one dared to name. And as I walked into the darkness, I knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning of a battle I hadn't yet realized I was about to fight. By the time I reached the hospital, the pain in my wrist had spread all the way to my shoulder. Every step felt heavier, as if my body were forcing me to carry not just the injury, but also the silence wrapped around it. I walked into the emergency room alone, clutching my arm to my chest, my face streaked with dried tears I hadn't bothered to wipe away. The receptionist gave me a sympathetic look and asked what happened. For a moment, I froze. I wanted to blurt out the truth, to tell her everything, but instead, the words that left my mouth were, "I fell." Saying it felt like betrayal, of myself, of the truth, of the part of me that wanted desperately to be seen. But the lie slid out so easily, like it had been waiting all along. She nodded, handed me paperwork, and I sank into a chair, staring at the questions I was supposed to fill out. Name, date of birth, address, those were easy. But when I reached the blank space asking how I got injured, my pen trembled. I wrote the same lie I had spoken: accidental fall. It looked ugly on paper, a stain I couldn't wash away, but I left it there, because the alternative, the truth, felt too dangerous. A nurse called my name and led me into an examination room. Her voice was gentle, her hands steady as she guided me toward the bed. She asked me to describe what happened, and again, the lie rolled off my tongue before I could stop it. She studied me for a long moment, her eyes too sharp, too knowing, but she didn't press. Instead, she wrote something on her clipboard and began wrapping my wrist. The care in her movements made my chest ache more than the pain. She didn't say anything, but I could feel the weight of the questions she wasn't asking. When the doctor came in, he ordered x-rays. The machine hummed, capturing the proof of what I already knew, that my wrist was broken, fractured in a way that couldn't be dismissed as minor. As I sat waiting for the results, I wondered if he would push harder than the nurse had. When he returned, holding the images, he gave me the expected diagnosis. "It's a clean break. You'll need a cast, and it should heal in about 6 weeks." Then, almost casually, he added, "Falls like this can happen, but sometimes injuries tell another story. You're safe here if there's more you'd like to share." My breath caught. The words hung in the air between us like an open door, and all I had to do was step through it. But I couldn't. My throat closed, my heart pounded, and the silence I had carried from that dinner table clamped down again. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "It was just a fall." He held my gaze for a moment longer, then nodded, respecting my denial, though I could see he didn't believe me. The worst part was, I didn't believe myself either. The cast was heavy, a visible reminder of what had been done to me, though no one else would see it that way. As the nurse secured it, she finally spoke in a softer tone, almost like a secret. "Sometimes people fall because someone pushes them," she said without looking at me. My body stiffened, tears threatening again, but she went on. "You don't have to tell me now. Just know that you're not alone. And if you ever want to talk, there are people who will listen." She slipped a folded pamphlet into my bag, quick and discreet, before finishing her work. I didn't dare look at it until later. Walking out of the hospital was surreal. The night air was cool, but the weight of the cast made my entire body feel lopsided. I thought about calling a friend, but who would I tell? Who would believe me over him? My family had already shown me where they stood, with silence, with denial, with complicity. So I walked home alone, clutching the pamphlet in my pocket like a lifeline, even though I wasn't ready to use it. Every step echoed the same truth. Healing a bone was simple compared to healing the betrayal of blood. When I got home, the house was dark and quiet. I set my bag on the counter and pulled out the pamphlet. The words, "Domestic Violence Resources," were printed across the top in bold letters. I stared at them for a long time, my heart racing, my hands trembling. Part of me wanted to tear it up, to pretend it wasn't meant for me. But another part, a quieter, braver part, folded it neatly and tucked it into a drawer. Not tonight, I told myself, but maybe someday. The thought scared me almost as much as it comforted me. I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything. The sound of the snap, the way he kept eating, the silence that swallowed me whole. My wrist ached under the weight of the cast, but it was my chest that hurt the most, heavy with the knowledge that my family had chosen him over me. And yet, in the middle of all that darkness, the nurse's words whispered through my mind, "You're not alone." I clung to them like a secret I wasn't ready to share, but needed to keep alive. As sleep finally pulled me under, I realized something important. Silence had been my survival, but it couldn't be my forever. If my family refused to protect me, then maybe I'd have to learn how to protect myself. And though I didn't know when or how, I knew one thing with certainty. There would come a day when the truth could no longer stay buried. The first morning after the hospital was strangely quiet. I woke up to the stiffness of my cast pressing against my chest, the weight of it a reminder of everything I wanted to forget. Sunlight streamed through the blinds, but it didn't warm me. It only highlighted the cracks in the walls of my room, the cracks that mirrored the ones spreading inside me. I sat up slowly, my wrist aching with every movement, and for a moment I wondered if I could just stay in bed forever. But reality doesn't pause for broken bones. It drags you forward, whether you're ready or not. At breakfast, my parents sat across from me at the table. My mother buttered toast without looking at me, while my father buried his face in the newspaper. The silence was suffocating, heavier than any words could have been. Finally, I cleared my throat and said softly, "It wasn't an accident." My mother's hand froze on the knife, and my father's newspaper rustled, but neither of them looked at me. "We're not going to talk about this," my father said after a long pause, his voice flat, almost rehearsed. It was a command, not a suggestion. And just like that, the door to conversation slammed shut. The betrayal stung more than the injury itself. I stared at them, waiting, begging silently for one of them to meet my eyes, to acknowledge me, but they didn't. My mother finally stood, muttering something about coffee, while my father turned the page of his paper. That was the moment I realized the truth. They weren't protecting me. They were protecting him. And the silence they demanded wasn't for peace. It was for preservation, the preservation of a family image that had already rotted at its core. Throughout the week, my cousins sent me casual texts, asking how I was, but their words felt hollow. None of them mentioned the dinner. None of them asked about my uncle. It was as though the night had been scrubbed from their memories, rewritten into something acceptable. I typed and deleted a dozen responses, wanting to scream the truth into their screens, but instead I replied with short, polite answers. "I'm fine. It's healing." Lies, all of them, but easier than forcing them to face what they already chose to ignore. Nights were the hardest. Alone in my room, I replayed the moment over and over. The snap, the way my uncle's face didn't change, the way everyone else looked down at their plates. My mind filled with questions I didn't have answers to. What would have happened if I'd screamed at the table? Would they have stopped him, or would they have blamed me? The not knowing gnawed at me, worse than the pain in my wrist. The silence of my family had turned into an echo chamber in my head, each unanswered question bouncing around until it felt unbearable. One afternoon, my mother knocked softly on my door. She stepped inside, holding a plate of food, her eyes darting anywhere but mine. She set it on the desk and said, "You should eat." I looked at her, waiting for more, for acknowledgement, for apology, but she only shifted uncomfortably. Finally, I asked, "Why won't you say anything?" Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she whispered, "It's better this way. Please, don't make things harder." Then she left, closing the door behind her, leaving me with food I couldn't bring myself to touch. Her words replayed in my mind, "Better this way." Better for who? Certainly not for me. The pamphlet from the hospital sat in my drawer, its presence burning in my thoughts. I pulled it out one night, unfolding it slowly, my hands trembling. The words on the page seemed to scream at me. You have the right to be safe. You have the right to be heard. I traced the letters with my good hand, my chest tightening. A phone number was printed at the bottom, and I stared at it for a long time. Picking up the phone felt impossible, like climbing a mountain barefoot, but for the first time, I considered it seriously. The thought that someone outside my family might believe me lit a spark of hope I hadn't felt in days. Still, fear clung to me. What if I called and they asked questions I couldn't answer? What if they told me to leave and I wasn't ready? What if reaching for help meant losing my family completely? The what-ifs swirled, trapping me between action and paralysis. And yet, deep down, another truth was forming. Maybe the family I thought I'd lose had already been gone the moment they chose silence over me. That realization both devastated and liberated me. Because if I had nothing left to lose, maybe I had everything to gain. One evening, as I sat by the window, watching the sky darken, I felt something shift. The silence that once suffocated me began to feel different, less like a prison and more like a blank space, one I could begin to fill with my own voice. My wrist ached beneath the cast, but I knew the bone would eventually heal. The question was whether I would allow myself to heal too. And for the first time since that night, I felt the faintest flicker of determination. I couldn't keep living in this silence forever. Sooner or later, I would have to break it. The decision didn't come all at once. It crept into me slowly, like water seeping through cracks. Impossible to stop once it started. Every time I looked at my cast, I thought of his hand gripping mine, the sound of bones snapping, and the silence that followed. At first, I told myself I just needed time, that if I stayed quiet, the pain would fade and life would return to normal. But the truth was, nothing about this was normal anymore. My wrist would heal, but the fracture inside me would not unless I faced it. I began to notice little things differently. The way my father avoided my eyes at breakfast, the way my mother kept her voice steady when she asked about my wrist, but never about that night. The way my cousins texted with cheerful emojis while dodging anything real. Their silence used to crush me. Now it revealed them. Each of them had chosen the comfort of denial over the discomfort of truth, and in doing so, they had left me behind. It was painful, but it also gave me clarity. If they could live with lies, I didn't have to. One afternoon, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at my reflection. My face looked pale, my eyes tired. But beneath the exhaustion, I saw something new. Determination. I whispered to myself, "You are not invisible." Saying it out loud felt strange, but also powerful. For so long, my voice had been locked inside, buried under layers of fear and expectation. Now, even in the quiet of an empty room, I was reclaiming it, syllable by syllable. The pamphlet was still on my desk, edges worn from being folded and unfolded too many times. I picked it up again, tracing the phone number with my finger. My heart pounded as I imagined dialing it, imagined hearing a voice on the other end asking me what happened. Could I say it? Could I speak the truth I had swallowed for so long? I didn't know, but I knew this. If I didn't try, I would stay trapped forever in the silence my family had chosen for me. That night I dreamed of being back at the dinner table. I could hear the snap again, the sound echoing endlessly, but this time, when I looked up, everyone was staring at me. Not with pity, not with denial, but with anger. Their mouths moved, but no words came out. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, my cast heavy against my chest. For the first time, I understood that the silence I carried wasn't just theirs anymore. It was mine. I had been complicit in it, and I couldn't bear that weight any longer. The next morning, I told myself I would call. I sat on the edge of my bed with my phone in hand, the pamphlet open beside me. I stared at the numbers, rehearsing what I would say. But when my thumb hovered over the dial button, fear surged through me, stronger than ever. I set the phone down, my chest tight, tears burning in my eyes. "Not yet," I whispered. But even as I said it, I knew the day was coming. I couldn't keep running from this forever. In the days that followed, I began to practice telling the truth in small ways. I wrote it in my journal. My uncle broke my wrist. I said it in the mirror. He hurt me. The words felt jagged at first, cutting my tongue, but the more I repeated them, the more they began to lose their power over me. I was building strength, piece by piece, reclaiming the voice I had been taught to bury. It was terrifying, but it was also liberating. Then came the moment I couldn't ignore. My uncle called the house one evening. I heard his voice through the receiver, casual, laughing, as if nothing had happened. My mother spoke to him softly, kindly, as though he were a welcome guest. Rage boiled inside me, hot and uncontrollable. I realized then that if I didn't act, this cycle would continue. He would keep showing up, keep taking, keep breaking, and they would keep looking away. I couldn't let that be my life. I wouldn't. That night, with shaking hands, I picked up the phone again. My pulse raced, my chest ached, but I dialed the number. Each ring felt like an eternity, but then a voice answered. Calm, steady, safe. You've reached the helpline. How can we help you tonight? My throat tightened, my eyes filled with tears, but for the first time since that dinner, I felt the possibility of something different. My lips parted, and though my voice was trembling, the words began to form. As I took that first step into truth, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. But I also knew this. Silence had protected him long enough. It was time to break more than bones. It was time to break the cycle. Telling this story out loud still makes my chest tighten. There are nights when I wonder if sharing it means I've betrayed my family, if breaking the silence will make me lose everything I once held dear. But the truth is, I had already lost so much the night my uncle broke my wrist. What shattered wasn't only bone. It was the fragile trust I had in the people who were supposed to protect me. The silence around that table cut deeper than his grip ever could, and it left me carrying wounds that went far beyond the cast on my arm. Yet, as painful as it is to relive, I've come to realize something important. Silence doesn't heal. Pretending it didn't happen doesn't make the memory go away. If anything, it makes the pain louder, echoing inside you until it becomes unbearable. For too long, I thought enduring quietly was the only way to survive. I told myself that if I kept still, if I kept small, maybe the storm would pass. But storms don't disappear when you ignore them. They grow. And that night at the dinner table proved that silence only feeds the violence it tries to hide. When I finally picked up the phone and dialed the helpline, my voice trembled. I expected judgment, maybe disbelief. What I found instead was a lifeline. A calm voice on the other end, reminding me that I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't weak, and that I wasn't alone. For the first time, I felt the weight of the silence start to lift. It didn't erase the pain, it didn't magically fix the fracture inside me, but it gave me hope. Hope that there is a way forward, even when your own blood turns its back on you. If you've ever felt trapped in silence, I want you to hear me clearly. Your pain is real, and it matters. You don't have to justify it, you don't have to minimize it, and you don't have to carry it alone. Maybe your story doesn't look exactly like mine. Maybe your wounds aren't visible. But if you've ever been hurt by someone who should have loved you, if you've ever been silenced when you needed to be heard, then you know how heavy that silence can be. And I'm here to tell you, it can be broken. Sharing this story is my way of breaking mine. It's not easy. Every word feels like reopening a wound. But every word also feels like healing. I know some people will judge me. Some might even hate me for speaking out. But I also know that somewhere, someone will hear this and realize they are not alone. And that possibility makes the fear worth it. Because silence protects the abuser, but truth protects the survivor. So if you're watching this and you've carried your own silence for too long, I want you to remember something. You are stronger than you think. Your voice matters, even if it shakes. And sometimes, speaking up doesn't just save you, it gives someone else the courage to speak too. That's why I chose to share this, even though it hurts. Because I believe in the power of stories, and I believe in the strength that comes when we refuse to stay quiet. If my story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own silence or someone else's, I ask you to stay with me on this journey. Subscribe to this channel, not just for me, but for the conversations that need to exist, for the truths that deserve to be heard. Every voice matters, and together, we can make sure that silence never wins again.